Good morning, everyone. Today we're going to try something a little different. I'm just going to be me. I'm sitting down at my desk, drinking my morning soda, and I thought I'd answer some questions. Before we get rolling, I wanted to ask, how's the audio on this? There were some comments yesterday about some feedback, and I've rewired everything just to see if it was solvable that way. So please let me know down in the comments below. All right. The format we're going to go with today is simply me answering questions. In editing, I might add some graphics or some commentary to try and explain things, but I'm going to try and just give you guys me today and see how this goes, because I don't think it was working quite as well as it could the other way. With that, let's get into the first question that's come up. Data centers, shards, instances, regions. This is all going to tie together into an overarching subject that eventually will lead us down the path of being kind of screwed by physics. In networking, there is, just like in every other aspect of life, there is a fundamental law, and that is you cannot break the speed of light. So what we deal with every day is how do we get around that? By get around it, I don't mean that we try and get around the speed of light. That's not possible. What is possible, however, is tweaking everything along the path such that we limit the external factors that add on to that inherent delay. We have to realize that there is no magic bullet. The speed of light is the speed of light. So communications going from the East Coast to the West Coast of the US or from the East Coast of the US to Europe are going to be roughly the same and unchangeable. There's nothing we can do about that. Okay, so what are the factors in data transmission? Well, it boils down to kind of two main buckets. Okay, there's the factors within a data center. So in a virtualized environment, such as AWS, which is where Star Citizen's running today, and that's a whole nother topic about that. The cost for a server or service running within AWS to use the network is actually incredibly small. These days, there are processing units built into most network cards that will handle all of the grunt work. When it comes to the kernel basically sending the message down to the NIC, that's kind of the end when it comes to processing within the server. The NIC takes care of everything from there on. However, the OS still has to manage that data transmission. It still has to either send the data or receive and process the data. And while we're very good about doing that today, in a situation like a MMO, the amount of data that we're talking about is not insignificant. We're talking about milliseconds mattering when it comes to especially combat, but desync in other ways that breaks immersion. At the end of the day, even though a network like Amazon in, say, Ashburn, Virginia, where they're just, data center alley on the East Coast, they might have 5 or 6 buildings scattered around the geographic area of Loudoun County, but effectively they're limited by the speed of light, which is meaningless at these distances. It's almost instantaneous. So as long as the servers are within the physical proximity of each other, then the inter-server communication will suffer almost nothing from the latency. However, from the processing, that's a whole nother matter. So if everything's bound by the speed of light, what are our options? Well, we've been spending the last 30, 40 years fighting this problem. Well, 30 years. There are two fundamental things we do at the networking level to try and mitigate this. Number one, we try and keep light as much as possible. Anytime we transition from light to another mechanism, and 99.99% of the time, that mechanism will be electrical to go to Ethernet. Anytime we change state out of light, we're taking a disproportionately large penalty on the latency. That penalty might be, you know, sub-millisecond, but it's there. So the more times you do that, the more you're impacting the data flow. Bit of a digression here. I'm going to try and throw a chart up on the screen. The way we encode data onto light is by using wavelengths. So in some of our metro optics, they're called gray, which means there's no wavelength distinction. All we're looking at is the blinking of the LED. Okay. That on-off state means 1, 0. In long-haul networks, you don't want to lay fiber and then for each pair of fiber have one connection or one data path. So over the decades, we've been refining more and more this idea of wave division multiplexing or dense wave division multiplexing, DWDM. What that does is by use of filters and prisms effectively, and by using these methods, we can use different frequencies of light or wavelengths and create paths for data to flow. So on one physical pair of fiber, we can have 48, 96 different channels that are broadcast or transmitted across that link. Usually it's called C-band. We're moving a little bit higher up into L-band these days. But each of those channels has a fixed capability to transit data. In the good old days, it was, OC3s, OC12s, OC48s, 192s. 192s were equivalent to 10 gig circuits. Today, the most common bandwidth is 100 gig. 400 gig is now in production and starting to become more used. And we have a path up to about 1.6 terabytes. Interesting note here, the copper Ethernet standards are stopping at 40 gig. So right now it looks like anytime we have to go to copper, we're going to be limited to 40 gig. And that's a whole different topic. I just thought it was interesting. So the other thing to know about optics is that they degrade over distance. By bouncing around inside this tube of glass, polished glass, incredibly good at preserving the wavelengths glass. But again, physics rears its ugly head. There's dispersion when the light bounces off the glass. The wavelengths eventually get muddled. Everything kind of turns into a gray optic, right? You can't really distinguish between the different wavelengths or between what bit stream is on what wavelength. So you have to have what are called inline amplifiers. These are phenomenally amazing pieces of engineering and way beyond the scope of what we need to talk about. Most of them today leave the signal in light and are able to amplify it. If it's an exceptionally long way, we might have to have a back-to-back or optical to electrical to optical. What I'm trying to get at here is there are two functions that we need to pay attention to, and one is the base latency. And to be honest, in the wide area networks today, that kind of is what it is. We might gain microseconds here and there with new hardware and new technology. We're so close to the ceiling in terms of what we can do given physics as we know it, that it's not going to be a paradigm shifting change unless that physics changes underneath it. As we've already talked about, within the data center, bandwidth is more or less meaningless. The capability of Amazon, Google, and Microsoft to switch Ethernet using some of the new technologies, some of the virtualizations like VXLAN, it's just unparalleled, right? They can pretty much connect any server within a metro area to another server within that metro area at almost zero penalty in terms of end-to-end latency. The other area to focus on is what happens once that information is received by the application. And this is where it gets complex. In this modern system where MMOs are being created today with the tremendous advancements of the last 5 to 10 years, I'm talking GPUs that can compute things like there's no tomorrow, right? I mean, what's going to happen when the server offloads the physics engine to GPU compute as much as possible? It's going to free up just a tremendous amount of capability within the main processing core. But there are still finite limitations. RAM, CPU power, memory bandwidth will actually come into factor if you're talking about offloading to GPUs. So what we don't know is where the economy of scale breaks down. What I mean by that is the more entities we pack in a small area, the more likely we're going to want to subdivide that area. So if we have 2 rooms next to each other with 100 people in them, 50 in one, 50 in the other, it's relatively easy to say, okay, well, at the doorway, we're going to split those off into 2 instances. And that will probably work. But if those rooms are small, then because of the way the replication layer works, both instances will have to be fully up to date as close to real time as they can get with what's going on in the other room. So are you actually gaining anything by separating those 2 rooms and creating all of this replication layer between them? When if they were in one room, then because the one server has control of that, there's very little need to tell the replication layer what's happening unless there's a change in the overall structure of the graph, right? Meaning someone dies, someone, creates a new entity. If they take a step to the left, not really needed to update the replication layer quite as aggressively. Whereas if you're looking through the door, you expect that when someone moves on the other side of the door, you're going to see it. So what we don't know is that economy of scale. Where does the subdivision of the universe cause enough overhead that it's actually a negative? SIG has no doubt modeled this, but in reality, that's why they're going to static server meshing first. Because they need to get in there, they need to see things operate, collect real data, and analyze that data. Even with static server meshing, there's going to be a window where, and I hope they use the preview channel for this, but there's going to be a window where they do analysis and figure out how big each of those static instances should be. This is not something that you can model it out, you can game it out, but until you see it operate in a production environment, you cannot account for all the variables. The last thing I wanted to talk about today was instance transitions. This is a hot topic in the comments. I've seen it on Discord servers. I've seen it in Reddit, everywhere. My take on this is it's going to be a challenge because we have to understand that what's going to be done, and I'm not saying that this is the methodology, but the logic of what's going to be done is every entity that can make a decision. So if that's an AI, potentially this will apply to them as well, but mostly players will have to have a bubble around them. Oh, and that bubble is going to have to be larger than their view distance. How much larger depends on the ability of the replication layer to fill in those blank areas before the player gets to them. So if I'm boosting in orbit, The replication layer and my server need to know in advance when I'm approaching a boundary. Let's say I'm flying towards where a station is. I can't see it yet. There has to be time for the systems to populate that information from another instance into the instance I'm in as I approach the boundary between the two, so that it seems seamless for me as I'm flying in and transitioning. Okay. The size of that bubble is another thing that I will be modeled out, but will likely run into challenges with finding the sweet spot there, because we don't want the bubble to be infinitely big, or we end up with, just a monolithic server spread out over different instances. But if it's too small, it becomes immersion breaking and it becomes really challenging for FPS combat or dogfighting. So when an instance transition happens, by definition, both instances are having to keep up with at least a piece of what the other instance is doing. This is expensive, right? And it touches back to the point I made a minute ago. Finding out how that's going to run and how smoothly that's going to run is going to be really the key to all of server meshing. The infrastructure pieces about compute and latency, those are relatively known values at this point. Transitioning between instances at the level of detail they're talking about here, where you can literally be having a battle as you float back and forth between instances, at least until the server realizes that and readjusts the instance boundaries to move your battle within within one instance or something. That's going to be a challenge. And lastly, dynamic instancing is going to make this even more challenging, because if you spin up a new instance, now you have to hand off control from all the other instances. They have to then shrink their area of control, and you have to do that in a way where you're not causing issues with two instances thinking they're managing one entity, for instance. I would dearly love your feedback on this format. I don't know if this is the right way to do things moving forward and in a more conversational tone, or if you liked the more presentational tone I was using before. Thanks to some feedback, I'm adding this from the future. Thanks for your attention today. If you'd like to see more videos like this, please subscribe.